Her name was Park Ji-young. She was 27 years old. She worked at a logistics company in Seoul. 12-hour days were normal. Weekends existed on paper. She hadn't taken a vacation in 2 years. Not because she couldn't, but because in her office, taking time off was quietly understood as a sign that you weren't serious about your career. In the months before she died, her colleagues said she seemed tired. But everyone was tired. That was just how it was. She died by suicide on a Tuesday morning. She left a note that said 4 words: "I just need rest." I want you to sit with that for a second. Not, "I am in despair." Not, "I cannot go on." Not a cry for help or a statement of hopelessness. I just need rest. She didn't want to die. She wanted to stop. And in the world she lived in, those two things had become the same. This is a video about South Korea, but I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is also a video about you, about the city you live in, about the culture that tells you that exhaustion is a personality trait and overwork is ambition. South Korea just took that idea further than anywhere else on Earth. And what happened there, what is still happening there, is not a foreign tragedy. It is a preview. Part 1, the number that changes everything. In 2024, 14,872 people died by suicide in South Korea. That is 40 people a day. One person every 36 minutes, every single day of the year. It was the highest death toll in 13 years. South Korea has the highest suicide rate of any developed nation on Earth. The OECD average, across all wealthy countries, sits at around 10.8 deaths per 100,000 people. South Korea's rate is 29.1, nearly 3 times higher. But the number that stopped me, the number I couldn't move past when I started researching this, wasn't the total. It was the age breakdown. Suicide is the leading cause of death for South Koreans between the ages of 10 and 39. Not disease, not accidents. Suicide. In 2022, it accounted for more than half of all deaths among people in their 20s. And by 2025, for the first time since records began in 1983, suicide overtook cancer as the leading cause of death for South Koreans in their 40s. These are not people at the end of their lives. These are people in the middle of them. People with careers and families and decades ahead of them. People who by every external measure, job, income, status, looked like they were winning. And they were dying at rates the rest of the developed world cannot come close to. The question I kept asking was, why? Not the surface answer, not stress or pressure. Every society has stress and pressure. I wanted to know what specifically is happening inside South Korean society that is producing this level of human destruction. And what I found was a system so total, so all-consuming, so deeply embedded in the culture from birth to death, that the wonder isn't that so many people break under it. The wonder is that anyone survives it intact. Part 2. It starts before you're old enough to understand it. To understand what kills people in their 20s and 30s in South Korea, you have to go back to when they were 6. Every South Korean child grows up in the long shadow of a single exam. The Sunung, the College Scholastic Ability Test, taken once a year in November. One day, one score. And that score, obtained at 18 or 19 years old, will determine more about the shape of your life than almost any other single event. Which university you attend, which companies will consider hiring you, what salary bracket you enter, who considers you a viable marriage partner. All of it flows from one morning. So parents start preparing their children early, very early. Most South Korean children attend hagwons, private tutoring academies, after regular school. Not occasionally, every weekday. Often until 10 or 11 at night. Then home to study more. Then sleep, then school, then hagwon again. High school students in South Korea average 5.5 hours of sleep per night. 5.5 hours for years.
I want you to think about what that does to a developing human brain. What it does to a child's relationship with rest, with play, with the experience of doing something for no reason other than that it brings you joy. By the time a South Korean student sits the Sunang, they have spent the better part of a decade learning one thing above all others. Your worth is your performance. If you are not producing, you are falling behind. If you are falling behind, you are failing. And failure is not a lesson, it is a verdict. That is not education. That is conditioning. And when you spend the most formative years of your life being conditioned to see your value as entirely contingent on output, what do you think happens when the output isn't enough? When the job doesn't materialize the way it was supposed to? When the life the system promised you in exchange for your childhood doesn't arrive? You don't know how to fail.
You were never taught. Because in this system, failure was never presented as something you could survive. Part 3. You made it. Now what? Let's say you survived the exam. You got into a good university. You graduated. You landed the job. You made it through the gate that the entire first 2 decades of your life were designed to get you through. What's waiting on the other side? South Korean workers log over 1,900 hours per year on average. That places them among the most overworked populations in the entire developed world. Nearly 200 hours more per year than the OECD average. More than workers in the United States. More than Japan, which itself has a word, karoshi, for dying from overwork. But raw hours are only part of it. The culture inside those hours is where the real damage happens. In Korean corporate culture, there is an unspoken rule that
You do not leave before your boss. Not because there is more work to do. Not because your boss needs you. But because leaving first signals that you are not committed. That your personal time matters to you more than your company. And in a workplace built on Confucian hierarchy, where your senior's perception of you determines your entire career trajectory, being seen as uncommitted is career suicide. So you stay. You sit at your desk. You pretend to work. You watch the clock. You wait for your boss to stand up so that you can stand up. And your boss, who's doing exactly the same thing, waiting for their boss, does the same. Entire offices full of people performing productivity long after productivity has ended, because the appearance of loyalty matters more than actual output. This has a name. It's called presenteeism. And in South Korea, it is not a quirk. It is structural. Then there is Gapjil.
Gapjil is the Korean term for abuse of hierarchical power. It is the boss who screams at an employee in front of the whole office, the senior who calls at midnight for something non-urgent simply because they can, the manager who assigns impossible workloads with no support and no warning, and faces no consequences because the culture has no language for junior employees pushing back. Studies on Korean workplace culture consistently find that junior workers absorb serious psychological damage from this hierarchical abuse with almost no institutional recourse. You don't report it. To whom? The person above your boss? Who does the same. And then, after all of that, comes hoisik, the mandatory after-work drinking dinner. Hoisik is framed as a social tradition. In practice, it is a loyalty test. You attend because not attending sends a message your career cannot afford to send. You sit with the same people who spent 10 hours making your professional life difficult, and you perform camaraderie. You drink when poured for. You stay until it is acceptable to leave. You get home at midnight. You get up at 6. You do it again. This is the life. This is what the exam, the hagwon, the sleepless teenage years, the university applications, all of it was building toward. For a lot of young Koreans, the moment they finally arrive at the life they sacrificed their childhood to access is also the moment they realize the sacrifice never actually ends. It just changes shape. And there is no one to tell, because the culture has made sure of that too. Part 4. The rule nobody says out loud. There is a rule in South Korean society that is never written down anywhere. You do not show weakness. Depression is not viewed as a medical condition. It is viewed as a personal failure, a character defect, evidence that you are not resilient enough, not grateful enough, not trying hard enough to manage your own mind. I want to be careful here because mental health stigma exists everywhere. This is not a uniquely Korean problem. But in a culture where your entire identity is built around performance, where you have spent your whole life proving that you can handle pressure, admitting that you cannot handle it anymore doesn't just feel embarrassing. It feels like the final proof that everything the system said about you was right. You failed the exam, you failed the job, and now you're failing at being okay. So people don't talk. They perform fine. They perform busy. They perform I'm just tired, which is both true and completely inadequate to describe what is actually happening to them. Of South Koreans diagnosed with a mental illness in a given year, fewer than 8% seek professional treatment, less than 1 in 12. Think about what that means in practice. Millions of people quietly drowning while standing upright at their desks, performing competence to a room full of other people doing exactly the same thing. A 2024 investigation by Time magazine found that South Korea's mental health infrastructure, the system of prevention centers and welfare services meant to catch people before they hit crisis point, is chronically underfunded and under-resourced. The safety net exists, on paper. In reality, it has more holes than net. And into those holes, quietly, fall 40 people every day. Part 5. The word for it. South Korea has a word that I don't think translates well because most languages don't need it. Gwarosa, death by overwork. Not a metaphor, a cause of death. In 2020, during the height of the pandemic, 14 delivery workers died on the job in South Korea. Their unions were direct about the cause. Impossible quotas, no days off, workloads that left no room for any human being to recover. These were not freak accidents. These were people worked to death. Then, in 2023, the South Korean government, responding to pressure from business lobbying groups, proposed raising the weekly working hour cap from 52 hours to 69 hours per week. 69 hours per week.
6 days of 11-hour shifts every week, legally. The justification from government was productivity, flexibility, economic competitiveness. The response from young workers was immediate and furious. Millennials and Gen Z Koreans, people who had watched their parents sacrifice their health, their relationships, their personalities, their entire inner lives on the altar of the company, and receive in return a pension that barely covered the bills, went to the streets and said no. The proposal was shelved, but the fact that it was proposed tells you everything about how the people at the top of this system view the people at the bottom of it. You are a resource. The resource is expected to produce more. The cost of that extraction, measured in human suffering, in broken relationships, in the 40 people who won't wake up tomorrow is considered an acceptable externality. Part 6. They started disappearing. Something else started happening in South Korea that the statistics alone don't capture.
Young people began vanishing. Not dying, disappearing in a different way, pulling back from society entirely, staying in their rooms, not working, not socializing, not dating, not leaving. The South Korean government launched a survey. What they found was that hundreds of thousands of young adults had effectively withdrawn from public life, citing exhaustion, anxiety, depression, and a deep conviction that the society outside their door had nothing to offer them that was worth the cost of re-entry. South Korea's fertility rate is now the lowest ever recorded by any country in human history. 0.72 children per woman. In Seoul, it's closer to 0.55. These are not people who decided children weren't for them. These are people who looked at what it would take to raise a family inside this system and decided they couldn't do it, or didn't want to, or both. Young people are not marrying, not buying homes, not building the futures the system promised them. They are, in increasing numbers, checking out. And the ones who are most isolated, most exhausted, who have been performing fine for the longest time with nobody watching closely enough to notice, for some of them, checking out takes its most permanent form. Part 7. Why nobody fixes it. If this system is destroying people, why does it keep running? Because it works. For some. The chaebol, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Lot are not just companies. They are the spine of the South Korean economy. They have enormous political influence, and they benefit enormously from a workforce trained from birth to treat overwork as virtue and exhaustion as evidence of dedication. The hagwon industry generates billions in revenue annually. It is a private education complex built entirely on the anxiety of parents who are terrified that if their child gets one fewer hour of tutoring than the child next door, their future is compromised. The anxiety is the product. Scarcity is the business model. The universities at the top of the ladder have every incentive to keep the competition intense. Their value is their exclusivity. And parents, many of whom went through the same system, many of whom genuinely suffered through it and came out the other side with stable careers and a better material life than their own parents had, often believe with complete sincerity that the pressure is love, that pushing is protecting, that softening the edges would be sending their child unprepared into a world that will not soften its edges for anyone. They are not wrong that the world is hard. They are not wrong that preparation matters. But there is a difference between preparing someone for difficulty and conditioning them to believe that their suffering has no value unless it produces something. There is a difference between resilience and the inability to ask for help. There is a difference between ambition and a system that leaves people nowhere to land when the ambition isn't enough. What South Korea built in the second half of the 20th century is genuinely extraordinary. A nation that emerged from war with almost nothing and became a global economic and cultural force within 2 generations. But the cost was real, and it was paid by real people. And the bill is still coming due in the 40 people a day who decided that the only rest available to them was permanent. Part 8. Why you should care about this. Here is what I need you to hear before I close this out. This is not a video about a faraway country with a unique cultural problem. South Korea is not an anomaly. South Korea is an extreme, and there is a difference. The culture that says your worth is your output, that is not Korean. That is global. The workplace where you feel guilty for leaving on time? That is not Seoul. That is London, New York, Lagos, Jakarta, Sao Paulo. The stigma that says asking for help is weakness, the pressure that starts in childhood and never fully releases, the feeling that rest is something you have to earn rather than something you are entitled to as a living human being. That is not South Korea's invention. South Korea simply took those ideas and ran them further than anyone else, pushed them harder, built an entire system, education, corporate culture, social norms, government policy, around maximizing their intensity. And what we are watching is what happens at the end of that road. 40 people a day. I think about Park Ji-young sometimes. I think about the note she left. I just need rest. Not a manifesto, not an accusation. 4 words that should not have been the last thing anyone said.
She needed rest, and the world she lived in had made rest impossible to ask for without it costing you everything. That is not a Korean tragedy. That is a human one. And until the cultures we live in, all of us, everywhere, stop treating exhaustion as a status symbol and start treating rest as a right, we are all living in different versions of the same story. South Korea is just further along in the chapter. Outro. If this video reached you, if any part of it felt personal, I want you to know that feeling is the point. Share this. Not because of the views, because someone in your life needs to see it and doesn't know they need to see it yet. In South Korea, the Korea Suicide Prevention Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1393. In the United States, call or text 988. In the UK, Samaritans are available anytime at 116-123. Most countries have a crisis line. Look yours up. Save it. You may never need it. You might need it for someone else. I'll see you in the next one.